Black Muslim cosmopolitanism. Dr. Rasul received his PhD in History and Africana Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, mashallah. We also have Ustad Mohamud with us today. He is a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, studying heritage studies and public history with a focus on the Islamic world. Previously, he has trained in the classic ulum under Sheikh Walid ibn Idris al-Manisi and Sheikh Tariq Awadullah at the Islamic University of Minnesota. He will be presenting his master's work in the genealogy of Imam Abd al-Ghani al-Maqdisi's Al-Kalam fi Asma al-Rijal as a culmination of his time in the College of Hadith. You guys can take it away.
Shukran, Aska. Dr. Rasul, we can't hear you, boss. I feel like we do this every time, Dr. Rasul.
You know, us elders, we need help. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak, and thank you so much for you all who are attending. You know, we pray that, inshallah, something we say is beneficial, and Allah put barakah in the gathering, right? Even regardless of what we say, you know, just the gathering, us gathering together to be in good company and to learn something that, inshallah, we can implement to be more pleasing to Allah, and our actions is enough, right? But inshallah, today our topic is Black Islam and Black Muslims, a brief introduction. And, you know, I'm going to hand it over to, you know, my younger, bigger brother, inshallah ta'ala, in a moment. He's going to start us off on the eastern part of the Atlantic, right, on the African continent. And we're going to talk a little about the history of Islam in Africa. And part of the reason we're going to start there is because the beginning of a significant presence of Muslims in this part of the world, right, in the West, in the Americas, right, happens during the time of the transatlantic slave trade, right, where millions of Africans are enslaved and brought to the Americas. And historians estimate that maybe about 1/3 of them were Muslim, right? It could have been more, right? But these are the ones that we know from various forms of evidence that they would have been Muslim, whether it be their language, whether it be their burial practices. And in some cases, we have actually written accounts to give us the history of enslaved African Muslims who worked to preserve their Islam. This is in Canada, this is in North America, this is in Latin America, this is in South America, right? So before you can understand something about that process and that history, you have to understand something about the places that these people were coming from. So inshallah ta'ala, we will start by discussing a history of Islam in Africa. And it's all just going to be an introduction, right? We can teach entire classes on just that, right? But inshallah ta'ala, hopefully this will be a good introduction and will spark folks' interest to continue to do more research and learn more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ustad. Salaam alaikum wa
rahmatullahi. Dr. Rasul. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, as Dr. Rasul mentioned. And you know, one thing I love about Dr. Rasul, and that's my boy, this is our second time speaking together, but we've had a relationship for a while now. I always, alhamdulillah, I always learn a great deal from him because my research is primarily in kind of transnational Blackness, starting in the continent and then coming to America, whereas Dr. Rasul's work does encompass that, but he's also done, subhanAllah, a great deal of work on Muslim communities. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Rasul, your thesis was on Sufi immigrant communities in New York City, right?
Well, just Islam in New York City broadly, right? Going back to the 30s, yeah.
Alhamdulillah. So the way that Dr. Rasul framed it is exactly as it is. This is a larger transnational and transhistorical conversation that we need to put in context. And so it only makes sense that we start in Africa, which is not to say that Islam, its iteration in America as a result of the Black African movement, both with enslaved peoples, but also, the very organic movements that grew out of the Nation of Islam, the Darul Hijrah movement, various Murid communities all over the East Coast and the West Coast, they work in tandem. So inshallah, to really get a firm understanding we're gonna have to start in Africa. But this isn't meant to be a holistic conversation. You're not gonna learn everything you need to know. This is a brief introduction, and the hope, like Dr. Rasul mentioned, is that you'll go and do your own research, right? You'll look into these topics, you will crack open a book, and really educate yourself on this, because there is no Islam in America today without the sacrifice of Black American Muslims and African Muslims who were brought to this country. But their story is so much bigger than that. I remember when the conversation around Black Islam started popping off a few years ago, there was a hyper focus on enslaved Muslims in America. And while they are a part of that history, that's not all there is. And so, the goal is to really move beyond kind of these surface level conversations and to really engage, one, with the scholarship, and then two, with the actual historical trends as they manifest. So inshallah, we'll go from there. And so, Dr. Rasul, I'll skip over your slides and we can go back to those later. But to put us in, I guess, in the scene, there's a few different phrases. And so before I start, my mode of pedagogy, I've always been taught that, a good teacher is somebody that always engages with students, with listeners. And so I'll pose a question, I'll wait for answers. I'm very comfortable with awkward silence. It doesn't bother me at all. I can sit in there all day. So I want to be as interactive as we can. And so if I pose a question, inshallah, I'm giving you my time. So I hope that you guys give me something back of your time in terms of, there's no wrong answers, right? The Salaf used to say, "Ithnani la yata'allamani abadani, al-mustahi wal-mutakabbir." Two people will never learn: the one that is shy and the one that is arrogant. And the one that is shy because he or she is afraid to get their skin in the game, get their feet wet. Imposter syndrome is a real thing. And then the arrogant one assumes that they know everything already. There's nothing for them to learn. So you never want to be either of those people. So I'll throw out a few questions, and I know all of you are incredibly talented, intelligent people. I know you have thoughts, so I want to hear from you as well. But more or less, this graphic here on the first slide, we see a confluence of different houses of worship, right? And I always start my talks with kind of in this way. So in the top left is Masjid al-Shafi'i, which is the oldest mosque in Minneapolis, where I grew up. The Somali, congregation was built in the early 1990s. Funnily enough, right next door is a bar, and behind it is a what used to be a strip club. So it's kind of located in a funny geography. But it's the oldest masjid in Minneapolis, run by the Somali community, not the oldest mosque in Minnesota by any measure. But there's a particular history that's connected to me. I believe that scholarship should always be informed by positionality, right? This is the mosque that I grew up in, the mosque where I learned the basics of Islam, where I learned to pray. My dad was married in this mosque. And below is, if I'm not mistaken, which is the mosque, Malcolm X, the Masjid Malcolm in Harlem. A landmark site for Islam, for Black Islam in America, and really for the culture of New York City, right? This is a historic building. The mosque in the top right is the Al-Mu'ayyid Mosque in Cairo, Egypt, built by a Turkic emir who was the son of an Ethiopian woman. And it's one of the most grand mosques in this part of Cairo. It housed a madrasa for about 600 years, was once occupied by colonial forces, and today is really a jewel of Mamluk African design, right? And so we're going on kind of this geographic journey across time and space to ask, what do these mosques have in common, right? And the last mosque is the Great Mosque of Kilwa in West Africa. Its geography, its design, its architecture is uniquely African, right? Resplendent mosque, right? A beautiful mosque. You can tell exactly where this mosque is, a lot about it by just looking at it, right? And that's a unique facet and kind of unique characteristic of this mosque, and particularly this geography, this architecture. We're used to kind of the regal masajid with the minarets and the domes, and we think that's inclusive of the nature of masajid or houses of worship, and it's simply not the case, right? The West African mosque tradition is beautiful. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Miller, the Great Mosque of Janae is also similar in kind of its construction. Allah musta'an. But this is, the question then is, right, Black Islam, African Islam, Islam in Africa, or Black Muslims. Each of those, those phrases, and I see Dr. Miller smiling, has a particular weight behind it, right? When you hear Black Islam, what's the first thing that comes to mind, right? You might be thinking the nation. You might be thinking the marriage of Black power and Islam in the U.S. in the 50s and 60s. When you think African Islam, what do you think? Do you think the Sufi tariqas of West Africa? Do you think the Salafi movements across, West and Central and East Africa? When you think Islam in Africa, do you think of the migration of Muslims into Africa? Do you think of, a uniquely indigenous Islam that was born and matured and, was conceived of in Africa? And when you hear Black Muslims, who's a Black Muslim, right? Who gets to claim that heritage? Who comes under that umbrella? Is it a space of inclusion? Is it a space of exclusion? These are all things that we need to think about. And beyond their nominal sense, but what's the actual substance behind these phrases, and what assumptions we project onto them? And is that indicative of their reality? And that's, inshallah, what we'll hope to kind of branch through tonight, right? Excellent. And I see a comment. Someone read it out to me. I don't actually have eyes on it. We'll get back to it later, inshallah. So of the names on our screen here, how many do you recognize? And anybody can come off mute. And this is where I'm going to ask for audience participation.
I recognize at least two of them.
Please.
Mansa Musa and Usman Dan Fadio.
Excellent. Excellent. What can you tell us about either of these folks?
Honestly, okay. Usman Fadio, I believe, was the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria, if I'm correct. I could be wrong. And Mansa Musa was the richest man in history, who's worth $400 billion, and basically he gave a lot of gold on his during his way to perform Hajj in Mecca. Am I wrong?
100%. You got every single thing. You didn't miss.
Oh,
you went 10 for 10, mashallah. Absolutely.
Thanks.
So we got Usman Dan Fodio, we got Mansa Musa. Let me ask Dr. Rasul. Dr. Rasul, who's Ahmadou Bamba?
I don't count, man.
I want to ask you because you're the specialist. So maybe help us with that one.
Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, rahimahullah, was a great Islamic scholar of the various sciences, fiqh, aqidah, and tasawwuf in Senegal, and he lived during the era of French colonization. And he basically mounted a sort of, I guess you could call it a nonviolent resistance movement to organize the indigenous people, the West African Muslims, Senegambian Muslims, to be self-sufficient and self-determined in the face of French colonization. They exiled him because they were worried about his growing popularity, but he, alhamdulillah, Allah, protected him and gave him victory. And his community is now one of the two biggest, probably the biggest, most influential in Senegal today. So he's a symbol for Muslims around the world of that kind of empowered, self-determined African Muslim, community.
That's my doctor. That's my professor. Exactly. No, Ahmadou Bamba, subhanAllah, his impact is felt today across really both the continent and even in this America, this North America. And it's exactly as Dr. Rasul said. Somalis should know who Ahmed Gurey is off rip, right? Ahmed Gurey, the terror of the Solomonic Ethiopian dynasty, a Somali imam, a freedom fighter, a mujahid, who really led a campaign of, immense military and tactical superiority over not only the Ethiopians in the highlands at that time, right, as they encroached onto the Muslim Eastern, the Muslim East, right, but also fended off the Portuguese and various other forces, right. And so we know that Ahmed Gurey was, like Ahmadou Bamba and Usman Dan Fodio, both a statesman and a scholar. And this is something that we see very often in both anti-colonial movements and in indigenous freedom movements led by Muslim scholars, mashayikh, who also, moonlight as mujahideen, right, in that sense. And so then Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who, the Lion of Algeria, really someone who every Muslim should know, whose name rings across history as a man of principle, a man of dignity, led the Algerians in their freedom movements for many, many years, was also a renowned scholar of the Sanusi order, was a renowned muhaddith, a faqih. And there's this funny story about him, and whether this was him or Umar Mukhtar is debated, but during the colonial period, the colonial forces, they were known for executing prisoners. And there was a time where they came into power and they had the upper hand, and his followers asked him, why don't you do the same? And he said very, very beautifully, they are not our teachers. And he's someone who really lived the idea, the ethic of the upper hand, right? And being someone of moral fiber and moral conscience. And so lastly, but certainly not least, we have Nana Asma'u, who was the daughter of Usman Dan Fodio, the founder of Sokoto Caliphate. Really is unique in her position, and perhaps not unique, but is a star among stars when we talk about the women of the West African Islamic movement, as being a scholar, a stateswoman, a towering intellectual who wrote in 3 languages, who led a women's literacy movement in Sokoto, and today really inspires a great deal of the scholarship that we know about Sokoto is preserved through her writings, both as an insider account and as a kind of regal magisterial account of the movements of her father and the larger Sokoto movement. So alhamdulillah, these are kind of Black Muslim luminaries from the continent, each of whom you can see existed more so than simply kind of an anti-colonial figure, but also as really principled, righteous people who we call qutubs, right? Poles of religion, people return to for questions, for advice, for leadership. And that's kind of the marriage of Islam, power and politics and piety. We see that in their livelihoods, their lives, and even really in the legacies they leave behind. And so it's important that we know these names, because this is our heritage. Whether you're a Black Muslim or not, it was because Ahmadou Bamba and Usman Dan Fodio resisted colonial violence that the movements in Pakistan and India and North Africa gained kind of the courage and really the guile to say, perhaps we don't have to live under colonial violence. Perhaps there is a way around this. And how you do that, I guess, differs from geography to geography. But these were the leaders of both a principled Islamic revolution in their own lives, but also as the gold standard of what it means to resist colonial incursions. And so we see that in every single person on this list, perhaps except for Mansa Musa, who was a little bit ahead of them, but is legendary, right, for his generosity, his statesmanship, and really the story, as recorded by some of the Muslim historians and Mu'arrikhin, is that Mansa Musa, when he made Hajj and he left, right, West Africa on his way to the Hijaz, collapsed the economies of some of the biggest dynasties on his way there. It said when he arrived in Cairo, the value of gold dropped so much that sometimes it was lying in the streets for people to pick up, because he was so generous. And when we talk about kind of the financial markets, I think we call him today a whale, someone of immense wealth who can flood markets on his own. And that's really what he was. But his wealth is often what he's remembered for, but he's so much more than that, right? Scholar, statesman, a unifier, someone who led the Muslims in a precarious moment in West African history. So that's his legacy. So I want each and every one of you, inshallah, as you're able to, look into these people, because in their lives is really a lesson for all of us, right? So we've spoken about African Islam, Islam in Africa, but let me put it this way. So there's a podcast that I host called Islamic History X, shameless plug here. And on our last episode, we talked about Islam in Africa, and we talked about African Islam. We probably didn't use those words, but the message was there nonetheless. It's funny, and I wish my friend Khalid Hussein was with us. We were having a conversation a couple nights ago about when we think about Islam, right, as a system of belief, a system of ideas, a creed, as well as a system of law, theology, Allah musta'an, guided by the Quran and the Sunnah, we tend to assume Arab. And this is the kind of the cultural hegemony. And even as we've come to the West, and Dr. Chairman Brown talks about this, he calls it the false universal. The idea that Islam is owned by a particular, right, ethnicity, a particular cultural group that historically have dominated not only the halls of kind of religious power and authority, but they've done that by monopolizing language, monopolizing culture, to be the guardians and the gatekeepers of Islam. And this is, there's no debate about this. This is just like a historical fact, a reality. But, you know, on the podcast, we talked about how in the 4th year of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ sends the Sahaba, right, to Africa, and not just to Africa, but to a Christian kingdom in Abyssinia, right, led by the Najashi, the Negus and Nagasa, the king of kings of Aksum, right, an ancient kingdom located in Ethiopia, where he says, go there and you will find what? Malikun adil la yudlimuhu ahadun minan nas. You will find a just king who will not what? Harm, abuse, or hurt anyone. And this is again in Mecca, right? The home of Islam, the birthplace of the patriarch Ismail alayhi salam, and the house built by Ibrahim and his son, right? And the foundation laid by Adam alayhi salam. The Prophet tells them, this place is not what safe for us anymore. We have no more security here. You need to go somewhere else. And the Muslims travel, right, from Mecca to Ethiopia. And on the way there, we know that they leave a great deal of both cultural and material evidence for their being there. Among them, the great mosque of Lamu, we have the great mosque of Zayla in northern Somalia, where, as it were, the Muslims used to pray to the direction of Jerusalem. And this is because this was the first qibla of the Muslims. The ayat comes down later at a later point to change the qibla back to the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Mecca. But we have, you know, material evidence that the Muslims were praying not only towards Mecca, but towards Jerusalem. And because of the qibla facing Jerusalem, we have concrete material evidence of a sedentary or perhaps a nomadic Muslim presence all across the coast of East Africa and even into Central Africa, right, at various times. And so when we talk about Islam in Africa, we're really talking about kind of the earliest watering grounds of a uniquely Islamic African tradition that you and I are often robbed of, and all of us really, because of the cultural hegemony that a certain subsect of Muslims has imposed over what we assume to be Islam proper. Right? We know that's simply not the case. And you know, we call this African Islam because there is a uniquely African flavor to it. It has its own architecture, its own distinct cultural markers, its signifiers, its own language. This is not to say that this supersedes their Islam, but this is married to their Islam, right? In a way that is a unique harmonization of what it means to be African and what it means to be Muslim. And these two identities don't necessarily exist in conflict, right? They complement one another. But undoing the cultural hegemony of kind of Arab supremacy that we see globally, and then when we come to the US and North America, we see that since 1965, right, and Dr. Sherman Jackson talks about this in his book, Islam and the Black American, who assumes the authority in our mosques and our masajid? Is it the indigenous Muslims of this country, or is it the immigrants from everywhere, really, but particularly from the subcontinent and Arabia, right, and North Africa, who speak as the voice of Islam, who speak and act as the vessels and the inheritors of the tradition? Is that right? Is that how it should be? Of course not. Is that how the cookie crumbled? Unfortunately, that's how it did. Are Black Muslims doing God's work in reclaiming that authority? I think my good friend Dr. Miller is a testament to that. But to the point, right? The distinction between Islam and African Islam, I believe, is largely imagined because the harmony between them is greater than the dissonance between them, right? We know that there is no Fath Mecca, there is no conquest of Mecca until there's the first migration to Abyssinia. There is no Battle of Badr until there's what? The second migration to Abyssinia, and the Muslims staying there and establishing themselves there, right? And so you got to pay homage, right? You got to pay respect and honor to the people that came before. The Salaf say, Al-Haqqu liman sabaq, you know, we give the right to the one who came before us. And we know that in this way, the Muslims of Africa were the Sabiqun, they were the first ones, and subhanAllah, they've carried that legacy for generations, right? So just some more examples of kind of the tradition, right? The Great Mosque of Janae, 20th century mosque. I believe that this is the most beautiful mosque in existence. This is my aesthetic. There is something deeply regal about the Great Mosque of Janae. Its construction is uniquely African. Its design is really in balance and in tune with the environment that it's in, right? Those spokes in the walls that you see allow for air to come through in a really an arid climate, right? It's well insulated. It's never hot. Alhamdulillah, I've never had the opportunity to visit, but the folks that have, you know, say this is like an oasis in the desert, right? The Great Mosque of Janae. Another example of kind of, and it's unfortunate really, what happened to Masjid al-Qiblatain, the mosque in northern Somalia, how it's been neglected, and how lawlessness and a lack of a state infrastructure can lead to the loss of great cultural landmarks like this. But you can see it's two qiblas, you can see it's two unique prayer niches, right? And that's a testament to the being of Muslims in that part of the world. Then we have the Sankore Madrasa, right? A center of immense learning. I remember reading an account from Ibn al-Wardi, a 14th century historian, who said that the jewel of the Muslim world was in West Africa. It was in Sankore, it was in Timbuktu, or back then it was called Timbuktu, right? Scholars would, and because of its remote location, people who studied in Sankore and Timbuktu were seen as unique. They were seen as afrad ma'al ulama. They were seen as unique scholars, inheritors of the Prophet's legacy, because they combined the Sufi tradition of West Africa with Maliki fiqh, the Aqidah of the Sanusiya, the Aqidah of the Qadiriyya, and in their approach to Islam, you see a balanced and middle of the path approach to how to study the tradition, right? And it was, subhanAllah, right now we work on, I'm doing some work on some manuscripts from this part of the world. The breadth of knowledge that is contained in these walls is insane, right? Euclidean geometry, Cartesian philosophy, we're talking about kalam, right? Dialectics, theology, law. You would graduate from Sankore and you would be in your own right a Muslim scholar, and you would go, the graduates of Sankore would go to all parts of the Muslim world, and they would be unique in how much they knew. People were like, what is going on, and where did you come from, right? Ibn al-Faqih, the Egyptian historian, said, we felt ashamed when we met Muslims from West Africa, because whereas we were simply specialists in grammar, because someone would go through the madrasa process and they would choose a taqassus. It would be a grammarian, a historian, a linguist, a jurist, a theologian, a mutakallim. He said the scholars of West Africa were 5 in 1, right? They were bahar min al-ilm. They were giants of knowledge. And that's our tradition, right? And that's what we aspire to be, kind of these eclectic, really learned people. And then perhaps really one of my favorite mosques, simply because of its architecture, but also, again, how its design is really in tune with that it's around, the ruins at Kilwa, right, in modern day Tanzania. Just like you can tell a mosque is a place, a jama, that's one of the words used in Arabic, a jama, a place where people come together, right? It's open floor plan. The fact that there's no roof, no ceiling, just these small domes. Its design is humble, but regal, right? And that's what mosques should project, and that's what Prophet ﷺ had in mind. I feel like we often get caught up in the kind of the many minarets of kind of Turkic architecture, the many minarets that we see all over the world, and those huge domes. Those aren't even uniquely Muslim iconography, right? We borrowed that from the Byzantines, right? But we've adopted it over time. What we're looking at is indigenous African Islamic architecture, and being in tune with nature in this way is something that you have to do if you live in this part of the world. The mission is to be both functional and devotional, right? And so the ruins at Kilwa today, I believe they're being repaired through UNESCO fund, but that's our heritage, that's our Islam, Allah musta'an. And then if I can very briefly, share this quote. This is the madrasa of Imam Shafi'i in my hometown of Guldubug, Somalia. Shout out to Guldubug one time. When you look at it, it's funny because the poetry on the wall here, why am I forgetting the poetry? Right? You look around the walls of this madrasa, and everywhere on the walls are lines of poetry, hikam. This is the oldest madrasa in we call Somali al-Bed. It was built in the 17th century that we know of today, right? Still standing on its original foundations. But scores of Somali scholars are educated here, right? And yet this is a gap in the literature, the scholarship. I don't know of anybody, Dr. Miller can correct me, who focuses on madaris in East Africa in this way, right? That highlights, their efficacy, their efficiency at producing both vessels of knowledge, but also practitioners of really a unique Islam in this part of the world, right? And what happens when you, this is the danger of marginalization and the danger of kind of grand narratives. Not everybody fits that narrative. And of course, somebody's left by the wayside, right? When you marginalize a certain history, you privilege another history as what? As foundational and as universal. And we know that the false universal posits that this is important, this is less important. And sometimes more violently, this is valid and authoritative, and this is what? This is invalid and not authoritative. And that's really the heart of erasure that we see often in Islamic studies, when we see African Islam being relegated to kind of a periphery subject or a kind of secondary interest area. When we sit back and we engage with the tradition, we come to understand two things very quickly. The onus on telling these stories, unfortunately, is on us. The onus of seeing those stories, number two, is not on us, right? Those who know, right? And they don't say, not all the time, right? When you're proud, when there's a certain fakhr in you and a love for your tradition, you wear that on your sleeve, right? Everybody knows that about you. Whether or not you're willing to be receptive to that is your choice. But gone are the days of pretending that that's not, that there's only one Islam and there's only one flavor of Islam. And I don't say this, and often sometimes I get pushback from out of my Desi friends. When we say that, I don't want you to get upset. I don't want you to self-deprecate. I don't want you to apologize, right? That doesn't do anything for us. And if anything, sometimes it's kind of performative. I want you to expand your horizons. I want you to, the next time you hear, your uncle, your aunt, your parents say something out of line, I want you to be like, yo, that's not the way, right? I know better now, right? And, think about this quote here from really our saint, our poet, our intellectual, our writer of the 20th century, Chinua Achebe, right, who wrote Things Fall Apart. He says, well, it's not true that my history is only in my heart. It is indeed there. But it is also in that dusty road in my town and every villager, living and dead, who has ever walked on it. It is in my country too, and in my continent, and yes, in the world. That dusty little road is my link to all their destinations, right? Think of that dusty road in your village, in your town, in your city, whether that's Karachi or Durban, South Africa, Mogadishu, if it's Sankore, if it's in Dijen, Mali. Think about, where is that road in your town, in your village, and does that road lead to your heart? And wouldn't you want others to see and respect that road? And don't you want others to see and to value that road for all the people that have ever walked on it? The danger of the single narrative, especially when it comes to the story of the Black Muslims, is that these roads get erased, right? And if you know anything about how America, and I'm sure Canada, revolutionized their industry and their infrastructure, how many historic towns and cities and places were bulldozed to make ways for interstates? The interstates are useful. They connect us, right? You can get to, I don't know, I could probably visit Dr. Miller. It'll take 24 hours to drive down to Irvine from Minneapolis. But how many historic towns and cities and cultural monuments belonging to Native peoples, to African peoples, to marginalized peoples had to be torn down so we could have that road? Yes, it's efficient, but it's the best way, right? And that's the metaphor that I'm making when we talk about bulldozing a certain history to make way for kind of an efficient or convenient narrative. The danger that arises is that, yeah, we get from point A to point B faster, but what do we lose along the way? And this is, more so than just African history or Black Islam. There's a lot of things that can fall under this category, right? So let's think about the history that we bulldoze, the history that we pretend isn't there, right? That we build over. There's a lot to be said about the gems in the rough that we can pull from this. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to be people that walk both that road in our village, and also people who build highways that are connect us and don't separate us and don't erase and don't bulldoze and don't speak over. Because when we do that, we destroy the inkling of community that we're working towards. So inshallah, I know that wasn't meant to be an authoritative introduction to Islam in Africa. We would need like 7-8 hours to just do the intro lecture for that. But maybe it's getting you thinking, right? What history are you not aware of? And if you looked at these images today and these ideas and these names, ask yourself, why didn't you know that? And I'm going to finish with the question of epistemology. And it's a mouthful, but follow along. How do you know what you know, right? Once more, how do you know that you know what it is that you know? right? How have you come about the knowledge that you know? And it's a question, right, like that demands that we really interrogate how we learn and see the world, right? And the comfort that we may be living in. If this was your first time hearing Osman Dan Fodio or Nana Asma'u or Amadou Bamba, there's a reason for that, right? And in the age of information, with these things at our fingertips, ignorance is an actual choice. There's no way, right? We call that jahl murakkab, compound ignorance. You care not to know, right? There is no excuse. So if you don't know those names, that's okay. But if you leave today not knowing, something about Kilwa, about Sankore, then that's your fault. And you have no one to blame but yourself. And you can't then ask, how do we support Black Muslims in our communities? And you're sitting in willful ignorance. It's a shame. So inshallah, I hope that that each and every one of us is become people who are striving to live Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also are people who are deeply and intimately aware of our own shortcomings and are humble and have enough humility to understand that this is a process and we all got some learning to do. So, and I'll leave with that. Dr. Miller, I'll pass it to you.
Ya Ustad Mohammed.
Shukran, Habibi. Let me know if you need me to move on at any time, because I'm screen sharing.
Okay. We can start. Oh, did I put it on backwards? This is okay. We can go back one, I think, or was that the first one? Go back one. Okay, no. You were right. Go back. Here we go. We can start with Haiti, inshallah ta'ala. Alhamdulillah. Oh, someone's asking, should they break for Asr now, or what should we do? Should we go for 15 minutes and break, or what do you think?
If you think that this is a good spot to break, it might be okay, unless it interrupts your session.
I agree with Oscar. Let's just break for Asr now. What about you, Zainab? What do you say? Zainab?
Yeah, I think this is a good spot to take a break.
Let's do it.
Right,
We'll be back, inshallah.
So what time do we want to come back?
Let's come back in 10 minutes. Is that enough time for everyone?
Yeah.
We'll come by 3:55. We'll start again.
Okay, inshallah.
Inshallah.
All right, khair.
Jazakallah khair. Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Should I jump in? Going to start? Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, everyone. So I guess I got the nod. We can go ahead and start. So, alhamdulillah, Ustad Mohammed gave us an excellent presentation that I really enjoyed, and it was very informative. And one of the things that he mentioned that I guess I want to kind of take as my, point of not departure, because I'm not departing from the direction he gave us, but to kind of get us into the second half of the presentation, is the fact that this history that we're discussing, this history of African Muslims, African Islam, Black Muslims, it's your history, right? Regardless of whether you are, East African, West African, African American, Desi, Arab, Afghani, whatever, if you're a Muslim living in the West, this is a part of your history, all right? And if that's not clear, inshallah, perhaps it will be more clear by the end of our presentation. So, as I said in the very beginning, part of the reason why this information is so important for understanding the history of Islam in the West is because, in North America, in Latin America, and South America, is because, these Muslims who were brought from sub-Saharan Africa were really the first to establish Islam in this part of the world. And that history goes all the way back to the early 16th century, to 1501 and 1502, when Spain began to colonize parts of Latin America. And they colonized the island, which is today known as Hispaniola. If you know Hispaniola, this is an island that's comprised of two countries today. One side of the country is called the Dominican Republic, and the other side of the country is called Haiti. And this is the very first place that the Spaniards came when they colonized Latin America, and they found the indigenous people, and they began the genocide of the indigenous people. But from the very beginning, they had enslaved Africans on these boats. And these enslaved Africans came from what is today Senegal and Gambia, right? From Senegambia. And we know because of what was happening at the time in that region that there's a good chance they were Muslim. We don't know their names. We don't know much about them. But we know among them, among the handful that were on that very first boat, a number of them escaped. And they began a very important tradition within this history of Islam in this part of the world of what is called Maroonage, or the history of the Maroon societies. Does anybody know what this word Maroon means? Can anybody help me out? What is a Maroon? Do you know what a Maroon is? Nobody heard this word Maroon?
Does it have anything to do with the Moors?
You know, in a way it does. In a way it does, but the word itself has a different etymology. So the word actually comes from a word Cimarron, which means like an animal that's escaped. And this was the word, from this word Cimarron comes the word maroon, which is the label that the European colonizers gave to enslaved people who ran away, right? So my good friend, our good friend, Imam Mohamed Mendes, I like the way he always the way he introduces this concept to people. He says, you may be familiar with Malcolm X in his speech. In one of his speeches, he talked about the house slave and the field slave, how there were some enslaved people who got to stay in the house and do work in the house, and some who had to work in the field who had a harder time. But as Imam Mendes puts it, we never talk about the third category, which was the person who decided, I'm not going to be in the house or in the field, I'm going to run away. Right? And this is a tradition that actually goes back to our Salaf, to the early days of Islam, right? When the Prophet ﷺ signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, one of the stipulations of the treaty is that if anybody ran away from Medina to go to Mecca, they could stay in Mecca, right? But if anybody ran away from Mecca to Medina to be with the Muslims, then the Prophet ﷺ promised to send them back, right? To send them back to Mecca. And so there were a couple of Sahaba, one named Abu Basir, another named Abu Jandal, who were among those who escaped from Mecca to Medina, hoping to receive asylum, but were then sent back to Mecca. But on the way to Mecca, they escaped and they established their own community, somewhere on the road from Mecca to Medina. And more followed them until they had a community of dozens and dozens of Sahaba like this, who were under the oppression of the Meccans, right, who were in charge of Mecca at the time, who were opposing the Muslims, and they would wreak havoc on the caravans of the Meccans until finally the Meccans said, "Yo, just take these people back, take them off our hands. They can be in Medina," right? But this tradition of seeking self-determination in the face of oppression in this way, right, is something that we see reemerges in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. So when from the very first enslaved Africans who were likely Muslim, who were brought to the Americas, that very first group among them, some of them ran away. And this trend continued in the early days of the colonization of the Americas, right? Such that Spain began to, the Spanish authorities and the Pope began to discourage enslaving Africans from Muslim countries. Why? It said, because you bring these people from Muslim countries and they come and they resist and they fight against us and they go and give dawah to the indigenous people. And so now the indigenous people, what they call Native Americans, right? But the indigenous people of this land, they started becoming Muslim too, and they started joining forces, right? And so the European colonizers from Spain and then later from Britain and what will become the United States of America eventually said, no, we don't want these people. They're too much of a problem for us. And part of the reason why they had this attitude is they were coming from societies in Muslim Africa, right? African Muslim societies, where the people were resisting the transition, the global transition that was taking place in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, right? So sometimes in our schools, we hear about how, you know, the colonizers and the imperialists from Western Europe came and enslaved these people, and they killed these other people, and they took land from these people, and nobody did anything. Everybody just rolled over and died, right? The European was too strong, his guns were too big. But this is not true. This is a lie. The reality is people were fighting back on the African continent. People were fighting back all throughout the Americas, right? From Canada to North America, to the US, to Mexico, to Brazil, all the way down. People were fighting, people were resisting, and it never stopped. And Muslims were at the heart of many of these resistance movements. So I'm only going to give a few examples of this just for time's sake. And I have a couple visuals because, you know, I want it to be like Ustad Mohamed and have something for you to look at so you don't get bored of just hearing my voice, inshallah ta'ala. But these are just a few cases, right? We can talk about more, but these are a few cases. So the first case I want to talk about is Haiti. And the reason I like to start with Haiti is because when we talk about Haiti, we're talking about the only successful revolution by enslaved people that resulted in an independent nation, right? That we know of in human history. The first independent nation in the Caribbean, right? The Haitian Revolution, which took place just at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, sent shockwaves and reverberations all throughout the world, right? Even some of the big, you know, European political theorists, if you hear about people like Kant and Hume and Locke and these people, one of the names you'll hear mentioned in that list is Hegel, a man named Hegel. If you don't know about Hegel, it's okay. There's Black Muslim history. It's not that history. But one of the things, if you hear about this man Hegel, you know, some of his theories, you know, some historians have made a strong case that he probably even came up with some of his theories because he was watching what was happening in the Haitian Revolution. So people who were theorizing about what revolution looks like, how it happens, what is the significance, were stunned at Haiti because Haiti, you know, Haiti blew up all the notions that people had about certain people being docile and being appropriate to be enslaved. So in Haiti, probably the two most well-known sort of early figures in the Haitian Revolution who inspired the folks who would actually carry out the Haitian Revolution, people like Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines. These are the people who, you know, actually led the Haitian Revolution. But the people who inspired them, just a few years preceding them, two of them, one was a man named Makandal, right? And this picture on the left is an artist depiction of Makandal, right? May not be what he actually looked like, but it's an artist rendering. And on the right is an artist rendering of another man named Dutty Boukman, who was an enslaved African who first had been taken to Jamaica and then later was taken to Haiti. Both of these were Muslims who were educated in West Africa, who came to Haiti. And can you hear me still? Okay, I saw a graphic about sound on my screen, sorry. But they came to Haiti, and when they came to Haiti, they were leaders in these Maroon societies. So this is a theme that you're gonna see over and over, that many times, many of the enslaved African people, especially the Muslims, they decide rather than live under tyranny, they're gonna just go and they're gonna escape and they're gonna live somewhere, whether it's in the mountains or whether it's in the swamps or whether it's in the forest. So in the case of Haiti, these two men both led actions that helped to inspire the Haitian Revolution. I'll give you one story, one sort of snapshot from Makandal in Haiti. They said one time Makandal was giving a speech and he had 3 handkerchiefs. He had one red handkerchief, or yellow handkerchief rather, one black handkerchief and one white handkerchief. And he put up the yellow handkerchief and he said, this represents the people who initially inhabited this land, right? The real people who this land belongs to, the indigenous people of Haiti, right? And even Haiti is an Arawak name. So the enslaved Africans who freed themselves and established the free Haiti, they named it in the language of the indigenous people, right? They could have picked an African name, but they picked an Arawak name, Haiti. But he said, this handkerchief represents the indigenous people. This white handkerchief represents the people who are currently in control of this land. And this black handkerchief represents the people who are going to take over and be in control of this land and will be in control of this land to the end of time. Now, One of the interesting things about Boukman and Makandal, and the other thing about Boukman is the title that he was given, but it means a man of the book, right? So the scholars say, the historians say, this might mean that he always carried a book with him, or this might mean that he memorized the book. And of course, the book is the Quran. So he was a man of the Quran, right? But both of these men, they came from a West African Muslim tradition that was marked by a couple of things. One is literacy, right? Literacy in Arabic. And many of the enslaved Africans who had come from Muslim societies who were literate in Arabic were able to use their literacy in various ways to help their people, to organize, and in some cases to achieve their freedom. Also, from this West African Muslim context, many of the people were, for the vast majority of the time, really all of the time, the Islamic tradition that they were taken from was one in which tasawwuf was a big part of the tradition, right? And so if you know anything about the Sufi tradition, the people who are familiar with this tradition, they focus on how to purify the heart, right? But they also focus on things like how to use the Quran and the names of Allah Ta'ala to heal you, to protect you, things like this. And so we find in the cases where we have enslaved African Muslims from West Africa who are using their knowledge to be able to help their people and fight against the oppressor, you would find that they would often write prayers of protection for one another, right? Sometimes they would give these prayers of protection even to the non-Muslim enslaved people and say, use this to protect yourself from the one who's oppressing us, right? They said, you're our brother, you're our sister, we in this together, right? So they use this kind of knowledge in the service of their movements to liberate people. Inshallah, we go to the next slide. So this is an artist depiction from Bahia, Brazil. And Bahia, Brazil is another example that I like to cite of enslaved African Muslims who are organizing for their liberation. One of the key, now in Bahia you find the Malay slave revolt, also in the 19th century, which is described by many as the largest slave rebellion, right, in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti, right? The largest after Haiti. And the vast majority of the people who participated in this revolt were Muslims, right? Particularly of certain ethnic groups. So unlike Haiti, where you had Muslims who contributed a great contribution to a broader movement for freedom and liberation of enslaved African people, in Bahia, it was almost an exclusively Muslim movement, right? So much so that the architects of this movement, some people have argued, some historians have cited, that they saw it as a jihad, right? And they were directly inspired by the jihad of one of the great Muslim luminaries that Ustad Mohamed mentioned to us, Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, radiallahu anhu, right, in northern Nigeria. Some of them had fought with Sheikh Uthman Danfodio or had heard about the stories of the jihad of Sheikh Uthman Danfodio and the establishment of the Sokoto Caliphate. And so they were inspired to take up arms to liberate themselves. And ultimately, and they used so they had created in Bahia in Brazil, they had a little bit more freedom than they had in some other places. So even though they were enslaved, they were able to worship in their own places of worship. And unlike what happened in Brazil after the Bahia slave revolt and what happened in other parts of the Americas, right, where Muslims were not allowed to practice their religion more often than not, Bahia prior to the revolt was a society where even though people were enslaved, they were able to congregate and practice their religion. And so they developed a sort of alternative society where somebody could be the lowliest slave. Somebody could be the slave who was disrespected the most by the slave master, by the slave owner, right? But could be a sheikh in the society of the enslaved and freed African people. You also had some African people who managed to obtain their freedom. You had a free community in Bahia, Brazil as well, right? And the Muslims from these communities were able to worship together and created their own sort of alternative society. And again, literacy in Arabic was part of what facilitated their ability to do this. And so they mounted their rebellion. Ultimately, they were not successful to the degree of being able to establish a Muslim polity or a free polity, a free state, the way that Haiti was. But some of the folks who participated in the rebellion were actually able to achieve their freedom and get sent back to Africa, right? To West Africa, to Central Africa, to the places from which they had been abducted, right? And when it came time to punish them, when the slave masters and the slave owners and the slave power, this is what we call the slave society, the slave power was able to, crush the rebellion, quell the rebellion, they went to get, other enslaved Africans and poor Black people, from the society to carry out the punishment. And the punishment they wanted to carry out, some got whipping, some were to be killed by hanging, but no one would kill them. No one would engage in the death by hanging. They couldn't find anybody, Muslim or non-Muslim, the ones who engaged in the rebellions and the ones who wanted to expose the rebellion. Nobody was willing to kill them in an undignified way. And so the Brazilian authorities finally had to give them the deaths of soldiers, right, by firing squad, right? They died as mujahideen, right? So this is, again, and this is an example where we have a direct inspiration from the history of Islam in Africa that is contributing to the organizing efforts of Muslims in the West to establish Islam here, right? Inshallah, we go to the next slide. So I really love this picture, right? And so now I want to talk a little bit about another example from North America. And this is, we talked about Maroons now, alhamdulillah. So inshallah, Maroon is now in your lexicon, right? We understand what Maroons are. And hopefully, inshallah, we all striving to be modern day Maroons, right? So the Maroons in North America, another example I want to give briefly is in Florida. So oftentimes when we hear about enslaved Africans trying to achieve their freedom, we think about them in the case of North America as being in the South and trying to escape to the North, maybe to Canada or maybe to the northern states, right? But in the 18th century, in the 1700s, in actuality, you still had slavery in much of the North. And the place that people would actually flee to obtain their freedom was in Florida, right? The Spanish had controlled Florida at the time. And Spain was going through its own conflicts with Britain. And so Spain decided that they would allow any enslaved African who fled to Florida, they would allow them to live there free. And the indigenous peoples of the Creek Indian or Native American or indigenous tribe in Florida also welcomed these enslaved Africans who liberated themselves. And so they created their own society. And today they're known as the Seminoles, right? Or they became known as the Seminoles. Also coming from that same word, Cimarron, which is the origin of the word maroon, right? And so you have a whole history of the Seminole Wars where these indigenous and African people fought for their freedom, fought to maintain their freedom, which they were able to do for quite a while until finally, Spain kind of backed out and didn't give them the same cover. And so some of them, they had to leave. Some of them went to Mexico, right? But they were no longer able to maintain Florida as a sort of haven for formerly enslaved people and indigenous people. But we know that some among them were Muslims. We have a couple little historical threads that let us know some of them were Muslims. Like there's a site in a place in Florida called St. Augustine, where you have a site called Fort Musa, right? So these little threads. And this is why for a long time, the existence and the contribution of enslaved African Muslims had gone under the radar, because the presumption among Western historians was, most of these people from Africa, we don't associate them with Islam. So unless we have some concrete evidence that they were Muslim, we think they were practicing some either other African traditional religion or some form of Islam that wasn't a legitimate Islam, right? Like when Ustad Mohamed mentioned this idea of African Islam, right? Some of the historians used to talk about what they call Islam Noir, which literally means like Black Islam, as an Islam that wasn't as scholarly, that wasn't as authentic, wasn't as orthodox. And we know that just was a misnomer, right? In actuality, as you learned in the first part of the presentation, right? The tradition of Islam in West Africa has always been extremely scholarly, to the point that the scholars in Timbuktu would put the scholars in much of the Muslim world sort of to shame, right? There's a story of one of the great ulama of Timbuktu. One of the ulama in the Hijaz heard about him because people from West Africa kept coming to make Hajj, right? This would have been probably in the 14th century. kept coming to make Hajj. And he said, I like these brothers, man. I like these brothers and sisters who coming to make Hajj. I want to help them. So he was a scholar. So he went to Timbuktu, hoping to get a position teaching at Timbuktu. And when he went, he met one of the great scholars named, I think his name was Mohammed al-Kabari. And he sat with him and he realized, I'm not even qualified to be a student of this man, much less to ask to be a teacher in his institution. So then he went to the university in Morocco and studied and learned and then came back to be a student in Timbuktu, right? So this is the level of learning that was happening in West Africa. Oh, keep going, go back, inshallah. So, but because historians didn't necessarily know about some of the contours of the history of Islam in West Africa, for instance, they didn't know how West African Muslim scholars and West African people in general often would write their indigenous West African languages using Arabic script, right? So people would find these writings from enslaved Africans and they would say, we don't know what this is. Okay, it looks like Arabic letters. They take it to the Arabic scholar. The Arabic scholar said, this is gibberish. So we don't know what these people are writing, right? And then also the sort of material culture where many of these people coming from Sufi Turuq, being in Sufi Tariqas, who would write out prayers and carry it with them for protection or healing or things like this. People found this and they said, well, this is some African religion. This isn't real Islam, right? And it's not until fairly recently that more scholars who understand this tradition have looked at these writings and said, okay, no, this is the writing of someone writing in Hausa or Fulbe or Wolof in Arabic script, or this is the writing of someone who wrote out Al-Fatiha or verses from Surah Al-Baqarah or something like this to carry with them to protect themselves, right? So now we know. Now historians have said, they used to say maybe 10% of the enslaved Africans who were brought to the West were Muslim. Then they said maybe 15. Then they said 20. Now they're saying 30, right? Maybe they're a third. Maybe in 10 years, we'll find out it was 40 or 50, Allahu A'lam, right? They also found things like burial grounds. So in New York City, where I used to live, if you heard about the controversy some years back around the quote unquote ground zero mosque. Some Muslims wanted to build a masjid by, quote unquote ground zero, where the Twin Towers used to be before September 11th, 2001. And Muhammad. And what people don't talk about is very close to that exact same spot. Some years prior to that, maybe 10 years prior to that, they found a burial ground where enslaved African people had been buried, right? And they found in that burial ground, a significant number of the people who were buried there were buried shrouded facing the east. So from that, they realized, oh, some of these people were Muslim, right? So if this place is a special place because of what happened in September 11th, it's even more so a special place because of the enslaved African Muslims who were buried there. And so for sure, if a Muslim want to build a mosque there, they have the right, right? So, but I'm saying this to say from this, we're starting to realize the clues, the historical clues that are pointing to the presence of Muslims in the Americas. And so this picture is of a man named General Usman. And he was a leader of the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons. This was a Maroon community that existed in the swamps of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. They were probably the biggest Maroon community, or at least the biggest that we know of in North America, right? The communities of Maroons were much bigger in Latin America and the Caribbean and South America, simply because these were places where there was a larger percentage of the people who were African people and indigenous people, unlike in the US and Canada, where the dynamics were a little bit different. So this was probably the largest settler community, Maroon community in North America. Thousands of enslaved Africans lived under the radar in the swamp. The women and the children in the community would live in more of a remote area where hopefully they would have some more protection. And the men would be closer to the city, closer to the plantation, where they would go and they would do business and they would contract their labor out. Or sometimes they would go to the plantation and they would take some of the fruits of the labor that they contributed to when they were enslaved, right, to feed their own families. Very similar to those Sahaba who, when they escaped from Mecca, built their own society on the road from Mecca to Medina and would go and take from the caravans, right? So this is, again, a reoccurring tradition. This is a sunnah, right? So they're reviving a sunnah in actuality. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammad. So we don't know that much about this man, General Usman. We know that some of the folks who knew about the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons, some of them were Africans who were caught, who gave some information about the Maroons, but didn't give them away. They didn't say, okay, they're over there, go get them. But they said, okay, we know about these people who live in the swamps. Some were people who did business with members of this Maroon community. And some of them, they mentioned a man who was one of their leaders, and they gave his name as Usman, right? They gave his name as Usman. And the historians have talked about why there's a scholar by the name of Sylviane Diouf, who has an excellent book. She has an excellent book called Servants of Allah, where you can learn a lot more about the experiences of enslaved African Muslims in the Americas. But she also has a second book called Slavery's Exiles. Slavery's Exiles. And that's specifically about the Maroons. And she talks about how, you know, whenever we look at these accounts from the period, you know, that give names and things like that, historians always caution that, you know, was the person who gave the testimony telling the truth, not telling the truth? And she says, if the person would have just been making the story up, they probably would have given a name that was a sort of identifiably common African name, a name commonly associated with African people during that time, right? But the testimony of the eyewitnesses was to give the name as Usman, right? Which tells us, one, that the testimony was most likely not made up, and two, that at least this one notable leader of this Maroon society was Muslim. He had the Muslim name Usman, right? We don't know if many of them were Muslim. We don't know if this was a Muslim society or just a society of enslaved Africans, or maybe just one or two of them happened to be Muslim. We don't know. But the one leader of the largest Maroon society in North America that we know of just happened to be named Usman. And this is an artist rendering that was given of him actually for a wanted poster, right? They were saying, if you can give us any information on General Usman, you know, we'll give you some money when we go capture him. But alhamdulillah, they never captured him. All right. We're going to go to one more slide, inshallah. And so all of that gives us a history into how Islam was established in this part of the world, right? In this hemisphere. And so, you know, we don't have time to give as much information as we like, but in the way of kind of giving the introduction, we give those snapshots from the time of transatlantic slavery. And the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons extend into the second half of the 19th century, second half of the 1800s. So all throughout up to the late 1800s, we have accounts of Muslims, right, among the enslaved people, and then the people who were emancipated, right, or who fought for their freedom. But then in the very end of the 19th century, 1890s, and in the early 20th century, early 1900s, we don't find many accounts of Muslims. They seem to kind of disappear. And there's different theories about why. One theory is that, you know, the Muslims begin to sort of go underground, right? And so you don't find them, you know, building masajid or anything like that, but they sort of blend into these other kinds of communities and practice their Islam in secret. But that begins to change in the 1910s. You begin to see communities of folks emerging, of Black people who are openly identifying with Muslim. The first, probably the first numerically significant of these groups is a group called the Moorish Science Temple. And this is a group, a community of people of African descent. In 1913, they form an organization following a man named Noble Drew Ali, and they identify as Muslim. They identify with the history of the Moors, right, who are Muslims from North and West Africa, who came to Spain as liberators. We sometimes say they conquered Spain, but they actually came as liberators, right? There were people in Spain who were being oppressed, who sent letters to people in North Africa and said, come help us. And they came in to help, and they established a Muslim polity with the support, interestingly enough, of the local Spanish Jewish communities, right? They established a society that lasted more than 700 years, almost 800 years. But in any case, Mohammed, this community emerges called the Moorish Science Temple that tries to connect Black people to the historical people of the Moors, and encourages other people to do so. Their theology is a little different than what we know sort of Orthodox Muslim theology to be, but from the very early days of their movement, you find people who become exposed to Islam through that. They're inspired by learning about the history of Muslims in the Atlantic world, in West Africa, in the Americas, to become Muslim. And some of them, they begin to, you know, break off, and they form more orthodox mosque and whatnot. And one of them is a man named Professor Mohammed Azzuddin. This is a very important man, a very important name you should know. This is the first convert, the first American-born Muslim that we know of any ethnicity, black, white, brown, or anything else that we know of, to travel overseas to study Islam. He leaves this Moorish Science Temple. He starts his own community, and in 1929 he leaves and he goes to Turkey. And I should say, Professor Mohammed Azzuddin, he's a man whose parents are from North Carolina, or South Carolina rather, a place called Abbeville, South Carolina. But he comes up to the north, he comes to Newark, he comes to Chicago, and this is important because the emergence of these new communities of Muslims happens during what is called the Great Migration, right? In U.S. history, there's this period where people are leaving, Black people are leaving the South to establish communities in the North and in more urban centers where they feel they may have some economic opportunity and they may have better prospects for freedom. And so Professor Mohammed Azzuddin is one of these people. And Professor Mohammed Azzuddin wasn't his name at birth. This is the name he took when he became Muslim. But he goes to Turkey and he tries to get the Turkish government to put some land, allocate some land for Muslims from the Americas who want to go and repatriate and live in the Muslim world. And this is during the reign of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was secularizing Turkey. So he said, we're not really interested in that. So he then goes on to Egypt. And in Egypt, he spends 5 years studying with ulama, including some shuyukh from Azhar University. And he's the first person we know of from the Western Hemisphere to do that, right? And he comes back in 1936 and he establishes an organization called the Adino Allahi Universal Arabic Association. It's the first national Muslim organization that we know of in North America, right? And this is in 1936. So this picture is from a convention that he helped to organize that took place in Philadelphia in 1943, right? So this is a snapshot of some of our early 20th century pioneers of Islam in North America. And in the center, you see one man who looks older, who's wearing black, who has a white beard. I don't know if we can magnify the picture or not, but that is Professor Mohammed Azzuddin, right? And yeah, right here. And to his left, you'll see a man, wearing a suit and wearing a fez. This is a man by the name of Haj Wali Akram. Haj Wali Akram will go on to be a pioneer of the Muslim community in Cleveland. He helped to establish something called the First Cleveland Mosque. Initially, he became Muslim through a movement called the Ahmadiyya Movement. The Ahmadiyya Movement from South Asia, from the Indian subcontinent, sent missionaries here to help introduce Islam in the West. And a number of African-American people were drawn to Islam in this way. Haj Wali Akram was one of them. He later leaves that and he starts his own community, which is like a Sunni community. And he's attending this conference along with Professor Mohammed Azzuddin. So this is Haj Wali Akram. Him and his wife were among the most important pioneers to establish Islam in what they call the Ohio River Valley. So in that area of Cleveland and that sort of Midwest of the United States. And then to his left is a man named Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal. Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal, here's a picture of him when he's young. He comes to Harlem from Grenada, from the Caribbean island of Grenada, or Grenada. He's born in 1891. He comes to Harlem in the 1920s. And him and his wife, a woman by the name of Mother Khadija Faisal, they establish the second mosque that we know of in New York City, and it still exists to this day. They established it in the 1930s in Brooklyn, but prior to that, he was doing dawah work in the 1920s in Harlem. He was spending time with the Sudanese and Somali Muslim immigrants who were there at the time in Harlem. He was writing, he was a musician as well, he was a playwright. He wrote a play about a West African Muslim anti-colonial leader by the name of Samori Touré. Right, that's what he was doing in the 1930s. But by the late 30s, him and his wife, Mother Khadija, they moved to Brooklyn and they established a masjid, which is still there today. And the people who attend this masjid are the African-American and Afro-Caribbean Muslim converts, right, in New York City, but also the Sudanese, Somali, and in at least a few cases, West African from Guinea and Senegal, Muslim immigrants in Harlem, but also the South Asian Muslim immigrants and the Yemeni Muslim immigrants, the Arab Muslim immigrants. At this time, the folks who are coming from majority Muslim countries to the West, most of them, they're not people who are coming to be engineers or coming to be doctors. They're coming to be migrant workers, right? They're mostly single men who are coming to find some way to make a way for themselves, make a life for themselves, maybe generate some money that they can send back to their family back home. And so they find common cause with the African-American and Afro-Caribbean and African immigrant Muslims that they find in places like Harlem and Philadelphia and Newark and Chicago, because they can't live around the white folk, right? The white folks say, you can't live with us, right? You too Muslim and you too brown, you can't be here, right? So they go and they establish themselves in in majority Black or African-American or Afro-Caribbean communities, and they build mosques with the African-American and Afro-Caribbean Muslims. They build their masajid together. They worship together. And so class is not a thing that divides them. They have the same interests. Of course, that begins to change later when, geopolitical shifts occur. And as a result, the majority of the folks who are migrating from majority Muslim countries to these neighborhoods are people who have more economic access. They don't know this older history of their own pioneers who come and build communities and intermarry with their Black Muslim neighbors, right? And so they start their own ethnic enclaves, their own communities, not knowing this history. And this where we begin to see division, right? And so I end with this beautiful picture of some of these pioneers. And I end, as I started, with a reminder that this is your history, right? This is your history. And our hope is that, inshallah ta'ala, by discovering this history, we can get back to that moment where the Muslims in this part of the world had a different kind of unity, a different kind of common cause, and they cooperated to build strong Muslim communities that were attractive, especially to the people who were disenfranchised, right? Especially to the people who were oppressed and the people who didn't have access in this part of the world. This is the history that made Islam thrive in the West. This is what made people attracted to Islam. This is what made people who even didn't want to become Muslim become friends of the Muslim community. I can tell you stories of about how in New York City, when, I don't know if y'all just heard about this movie, Judas and the Black Messiah, that just came out, right? Maybe some of you, about Fred Hampton, leader of the Black Panther Party, who was assassinated at 21 years old by the Chicago Police Department, right? But I can tell you stories about how when the United States law enforcement was targeting, Black communities, including Black Muslim communities in places like New York, how the non-Muslim residents of these places would defend the Muslims, right? They see the police storming the mosque and they throw bricks and bottles at the police and say, we're not going to let you do that to our brothers and sisters in that community, right? This is because of the way in which these Muslims contributed to their broader communities, to the broader neighborhood. They didn't just say the things we do are just to benefit the Muslims. They did the things to benefit the broader community in terms of the businesses they established, in terms of the schools they established, in terms of the institutions they established. And they stood up against oppression, right? And these things are the things that attracted people to Islam and won them support. And so we want to revive these traditions of our Black Muslim pioneers, foremothers and forefathers, which is actually in itself a revival of the tradition of our Prophet ﷺ, who did the same things. And so I'll end there, inshallah ta'ala, so we can ask some questions. Thank you for being patient and listening. And I pray, inshallah, something was beneficial. And I look forward to now having a discussion with you all. I really enjoy having discussions a lot more than giving talks, because I want to learn from you all too. So, inshallah, bismillah.
All right, Jazakallah khair. Both of you guys did a wonderful job. So much to learn. So I'll start off with some of the questions. I put the link in the chat for anyone who does not have the anonymous question link, and you guys can just enter your questions there. So the first question is, when is your next podcast episode coming out?
Soon, inshallah. We have we got an episode on continuation of our last episode on Somali history, And let's see if Mohammed Chowder, Mohammed Osama is in here. He will be doing a special announcement alert. We'll be doing an episode on Islamic art, inshallah. So probably a good time to announce that. He's in here somewhere.
Great, Jazakallah. And the next question is, how did European colonization affect the African religious sphere? For example, some regions/countries are seen as more strict, conservative, or Arabized.
This is a good question. Dr. Miller, you want to jump in? I think it's a good question, and there's definitely layers there. So colonization and by factor of imperialism, these projects, they seek to do, well, really two things. One, to dominate, and then two, to extract resources along the way. So for example, in places like India, the colonial enterprise in India sought to co-opt the Muslim movement. That was the British set up courts, they appointed qadis, they relegated and regulated who could and could not act as a kind of vehicle or authority for Islamic learning and knowledge. They set up awqaf, madaris in the name of the queen, but for the local Muslim population. And that was their approach there. In places like, and Dr. Rasul can talk about West Africa, but my specialty is in East Africa. The British had and the Italians had a resoundingly different approach. Their approach, especially in Somalia, was just outright violence, right? We often hear about Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, who led a resistance movement in Somalia, Western Somalia, Central Somalia, but we forget about Sheikh Abikra Gaflo, the Bimal movement, the Northern Maroon movement. So there was more than, that approach was, for them, was overtly militaristic, right? It was designed to crush the spirit of any resistance by way of really overpowering them. You have to remember, the British were colonial powerhouses, right? They had toppled empires, they had put to the sword countless nations, but in Somalia, they had a rougher go, right? The Dervish movement really gave them a hard time. And so when they couldn't beat them, they played the long game, right? Kind of economic and social domination by establishing colonial governors, establishing schools, missionary work, proletizing. And so there it was overtly militaristic with a kind of a Christian ethic. And I know that colonization as a means to an end to dominate, to extract, it looks different depending on where you are. And so if the question is about Arabization, maybe we need to have a conversation about kind of the influence and the domination of Arab actors, either as agents of colonialism, right, as sub-administrators in various Muslim lands. For example, in Syria, in the Hijaz, where we see local rulers get co-opted by colonial movements. That may have a distinctly different twang than, say, an independence movement kicking off in South India, South Asia, or West Africa. And so, it's never really good to generalize. I don't think there's one size fits all, because again, colonial movements are as varied as the colonial actors, right? The British were very different than the Algerians, than the French. What the French did in Algeria and in Libya, unspeakable, right? It was really to break the Algerians, to break the Libyans, not to absolve the British of their crimes, because the British were arch criminals, they were the original colonizers. But the policy of Algeria, the policy in Libya was, subhanAllah, Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, writing in the 20th century, says, and the 18th century, says that, we thought we had seen the evils of this world, and then we met the French. Right? He said, we thought we knew all evil. We thought we had seen kind of violence, corruption, and chaos. Then we met the French, and the French, subhanAllah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, punish them for what they did. They really decimated an entire generation, up to at least 1.5 million Algerians, many of whom we've never heard from again, just lost to history, right? So that outright violence is very different than kind of the sustained violence of economic and social violence that is implemented along lines of state actors, controlling institutions, dominant institutions. Shout out to our intellectual hero, Tayyib Saleh, the Sudani writer, who had a wonderful observation. He says that when the colonial period ended, he said it didn't really end, because the British left people who think like they do, right? They left in their place actors, systems, institutions that can function even when the British are long gone. They're back on that cold rock in the middle of the Atlantic, but their presence, their domination remains because they've trained a class of people who we call colonial conspirators to think and act the way that they do. And we see that even in my own home country of Somalia, right? Some of the earliest colonial elites, when independence ended, a lot of them were like, yo, we should try to keep things to the book, right? We should try to emulate the British in the way that they moved and the way that they governed. But it's a dangerous path to walk, because the path of independence means a complete divorcing of your context from the violence of colonialism, which is really a lifelong process. So if you hear yelling in the back, my in-laws are over. If you hear music and little kids running around. So Dr. Rasul, I'll let you jump in, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. And the reason I didn't talk, I'm glad I didn't talk first, because you said most of it, so I don't have to say so much. But I wasn't talking because I was texting you that you gotta hit me up when the podcast is about to go down. I need to.
No, we need a West Africa guest episode. So what are you saying? Let's make it happen.
I want to listen. Now the other stuff.
No, I pinned you in already. You're on my calendar.
Mashallah. But just to add a little bit, alhamdulillah, what has already been said is the bulk of the story, and especially, the fact that different colonizers had different strategies. And so they were all insidious, right? But the British, they had a way of coming to places and, the British had a way of coming to places and finding, who they could how they could divide people, right? And how they could find the British pursued a policy of what they call indirect rule, where they would find local people who would basically rule in their interests, govern in their interests. But I'll just add a few things. The first thing I'll add is this. When we talk about colonization in all of sub-Saharan Africa, but especially West and Central Africa, we're also talking about slavery, right? We're also talking about enslavement. And one of the realities of the early colonial presence, before the actual moment of colonization where Portugal and Britain and France, said, okay, this is mine. I own Senegal, right? I own Nigeria. Before that moment, you had a kind of soft colonization, where even though these countries didn't declare themselves to be, in charge of these different regions in sub-Saharan Africa, they certainly tried to exert their influence and to obtain the resources of these regions in sub-Saharan Africa. And what that effectively did is it created a new type of African ruler. Before that, the folks who ruled, who governed various African societies, they were like other rulers in other places, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but there was a balance where if a ruler was, not fulfilling their responsibilities to the people might leave, right? Or the people might rebel. And so more often than not, folks who were governing in these African societies, they made sure to provide for the needs of their people, right? Whether it be because they're altruistic, in some cases, they were just good people who wanted to take care of their people, or because of the social pressures that existed. When the European came, they created a new kind of African ruler who had a predatory relationship to the people they governed. They would say, okay, you're going to look out for our interests. Okay, we're going to give you guns, right? And, in sub-Saharan Africa, they made amazing technological advances in things like agriculture, right? In some cases, even, seafaring technology, right? Not for the types of vessels that will carry you long distances, but types of vessels that will carry you to places quickly, right? They had technological advances in terms of things like metallurgy, but they didn't have the kind of gun that the European managed to manufacture. So the European would say, okay, we only going to give you the gun if you give us some slaves, right? And so if you said, no, we don't want to engage in this transatlantic slave trade, okay, we're going to give somebody else the gun and they're going to use the gun on you and sell your people into slavery, right? So it destabilized the region in a very significant way. And this had an impact on the religious culture. This had an impact on systems of governance and what have you. The second thing that I'll mention is in certain parts of, I'll say West Africa in particular, but not just West Africa. You find this in Sudan as well. You find this in a lot of places, but particularly in places like Senegal, Gambia, Mauritania, you know, initially when the colonizer came, when the French came, in those cases, the indigenous African Muslims, they fought. They said, what we have to do is we have to fight jihad against these people to get them out of our land, right? And when they saw that jihad wouldn't work, some of them, they said, okay, we got to make hijra, right? Like, for instance, the descendants of Sheikh Uthman Anfodio, rahimahullah, they migrated to Sudan. They went east, right? So you find the descendants of Sheikh Uthman Anfodio, many of them, they live in Sudan now, right? They have a khalifa that's directly connected to the Shehu. But in places like Senegal, Gambia, where you have people like Sheikh Ahmed Bamba, people like Sheikh Umar al-Futi, who's another name we didn't mention, great West African Islamic scholar, thinker, Sufi, scholar of Hadith, scholar of Aqidah and whatnot. He fought against the French. And he actually fought with a lot of success. He built a society that, in terms of territory, almost rivaled the great empire of Songhai, you know. But ultimately, when communities saw that they weren't going to be able to physically beat the European power, even though they gave them a run, right? From Senegal to Sudan to Somalia. But what they did in some places is they migrated to remote areas, right? So in Senegal in particular, you find this was the trend. You know, folks fought, the Muslims fought. When they saw they weren't going to be able to win a physical fight, they said, okay, the French, they're in Dakar. That's the capital of Senegal. They said, okay, you keep Dakar. We're going to move out to rural areas, right? And in these rural areas, we'll establish ourselves and we'll establish our masjid. And we have a school where we can teach, so we can combat the intellectual, you know, colonization that's going on with our children. And we want to have a farm so we can try to become, you know, economically independent through agriculture, right? And even to this day in Senegal, when you go, you find all of these cities, all of these Muslim Sufi towns that are in some cases huge. 500,000 people have flocked to these places. In one city, you have 500,000 residents. In another place, you have 1 million residents, right? Outside of the capital, these places that are dedicated to Islamic learning and living, where the shuyukh, the ulama, were able to obtain a certain degree of self-determination, even in the wake of colonization, right? And the last thing I'll say, and maybe this is what the questioner was hinting at with the Arab hegemony piece, I don't know, but one of the things that happens as these Western European countries colonize essentially the world, some places it's a firm colonization, some places it's more of a soft kind of, as you mentioned, Mr. Mohammed, like a socioeconomic kind of colonization, right? But one of the things they do is they affect the epistemology. Like you said, how do you know what you know, right? The West is able to effectively change the epistemology of folks all over the world. So suddenly, our old ways of knowing, we begin to question them, right? And in particular, there are certain intellectual currents that emerge in the Arab world, right, that are reactions to this trend. Folks are trying to modernize. The British are coming in and saying, you know, this old way that you have of doing things, of thinking about things, that you think you can write a prayer and this is going to cure you, this is not the way, right? And so they change the epistemology and they change the style of education. And the institutions that emerge, some of them, not all of them, but some of the institutions that emerge in the Arab world in that context, then go on to try to establish a new kind of intellectual hegemony in the Muslim world, including in Africa, right? So this is where you find different debates between, you know, the Sufi and the Salafi, and, you know, you'll find part of what's at stake is old traditional ways of knowing and learning and practicing Islam get sort of deep sixed, right? They get thrown to the side for a more modern kind of epistemology, right? That tries to, you know, that tries to argue for the legitimacy of Islam based on a kind of modern Western kind of worldview, right? I give you one just simple example. When I was young, I used to love all of the books that talked about, you know, Islam and science. I still love them. I think they're great. That talk about, you know, how there's all these miracles in the Quran, how did the Rasulullah know about how bees make honey and how clouds make rain, all of that, right? And I still love it. It's good. If you're reading those books, keep reading them.
But at some point, I realized that, you know, for some people, it builds up a kind of orientation where when you ask, why do you do such and such a thing as a Muslim, you have to have a modern science justification in order for us to know that it's true. Why do we make salat 5 times a day? Is it because there's some scientific mechanism that tells us if you do it this way, this many times? No, we do it because Rasulullah told us to do it, right? How do we know that the Quran has the effect that it has, right? Because we know it's Allah's book, right? So this is something that we have to keep in mind when we look at how, you know, colonization has sort of transformed our epistemology, our worldview. And this had a big impact in Africa, so such that many of the ways in which Islam had traditionally been practiced, people begin to question.
Jazakallah. So the next question is, there are 2 questions, but I'll just combine them. So the first being, how can non-Black Muslims show support to our Black friends? And how can Muslim groups better support the Black Muslim community consistently? Emphasis on the consistency.
You want me to do this one first? Alhamdulillah, you started us off last time, so I won't.
Please, you know, I'm sure the questioner is sincere and is in earnest.
Yeah.
But if I had a penny for every time I heard this question, man, I'd be a millionaire.
Nah.
Questions,
that means you have the answer now.
You got it, boss. I'm going on mute.
Well, you know, there's a lot of things. I mean, you know, Ustad said something that I thought was very on point. You might have missed it, but he said, the next time your parents say XYZ, right? So, you know, a lot of these things, they start, you know, you start in your home, you start in your own community. And, you know, you arm yourself with knowledge, you arm yourself with information. You know, if you now know the debt that all Muslims in this part of the world owe to Black Muslims, right? Then this should affect your behavior, right? This should affect how you respond when you hear people say things that, you know, aren't accurate. But also, I think on another level, you know, a lot of times when I hear this question, because I've heard it a lot too, the response that people give is, you know, on the personal level, that we should make our communities inviting and, you know, make sure not to engage in sort of microaggressions and things like this. And alhamdulillah, that's good. But I think, you know, we can do more than that. We can do better than that. That's sort of a baseline place to start. I think really, if we want to talk about supporting Black Muslims, you know, the first thing that we need to, and you know, as students, right? The first thing you want to do in your Muslim community, in your school, is you want to make sure that Black Muslims who are present, you know, are engaged, feel comfortable. But you also want to make sure that your organization speaks to their needs, right? And also your organization should speak to the needs of the broader Black community, right? This is how Islam spreads and flourishes. When you serve, you know, Rasulullah was asked who's the best person. He said the best person is the one who's most beneficial to creation, right? So you serve the community, you serve the broader community. Also, you know, you stand for what is just, right? And the Muslims should be standing for what is just with an audacity that other folks can't match, right? So we were talking the other day about Imam Talib Abdul Rashid, may Allah preserve him, the Imam of the oldest Sunni mosque in Harlem, right? The mosque that Malcolm's folks started when they left the Nation of Islam in the 1960s. But he said, you know, he gave a khutbah one day for Earth Day. And he was saying, you know, Earth Day, you know, when Earth Day comes, the Muslims should be the first people lined up, you know, for the Earth Day celebration, planting trees and whatnot, you know. When it comes to, you know, protest, police brutality, the Muslims should be the first in that rank as well, right? The Muslims should always be striving to be the first in standing up for what is right and joining the right and forbidding the wrong. So that's part of it. And then on another level, as you get older, you know, when you leave, you know, your institution of learning and you go out into the world, you should carry with you, you know, a commitment to these kinds of issues, because sooner or later you're going to be the ones on the boards of your masajid, you know, You're going to be the ones who are organizing the institutions that are serving the community. And so what are the priorities? What is the role of this community? One of the reasons why I like talking about the history of Islam in this part of the world and talking about, centering Black Muslim history is because ultimately, this is your legacy. This is the risala for Muslims in this part of the world to the broader society, right? People don't, in this part of the world, by and large, who embraced Islam or came to love Islam, it wasn't because, they read a pamphlet that broke down Aqidah in the perfect way. It's because they heard about Muhammad Ali, right? Or they heard about Malcolm X, or they saw Muslims standing up for what is right. So if we abandon that, our communities will dissipate. They won't grow, they won't thrive, they won't become attractive to people. People, may Allah protect us, we find people leaving the religion, right? We find people entering the religion because they learn about this history of Islam and Muslims' role in standing up for what is just. And then they come into the religion and they find communities that are not just, and then they leave the religion, right? So if we want our communities to thrive, then we have to be committed to, this kind of posture, to this kind of politics, right? I'll stop there because I really want to know what Ustad Mohammed has to say.
This question, Ashabi used to say to his students, there are no bad questions. There are just questions that are posed poorly. And I'm not saying anything about the person that posed the question, but we really have to interrogate why the question is necessary sometimes. If people treated Black Muslims like, actual human beings, people with of value and worth, this would never be a question. But I remember, and Dr. Rasul, were talking about Imam Talib last night. Imam Talib said that, when he was growing up and he was coming to terms with the microaggressions, the violence of being questioned, and even as, he's a senior scholar now, subhanAllah, he said, I'm really a believer in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about changing evil one of three ways, right? The weakest way is when you hear your parents, those of you that come from non-Black communities, your friends, people in your circle, when you hear them say some foul stuff, you just like, oh man, it's bad, and you hate it in your heart. You soft, right? A step up from that is when you call it out, right? When you hear evil being said or done, people being denigrated, dehumanized, devalued, when you speak with your mouth, with your Twitter fingers, whatever way that you know how, right? But speaking up. And then the best way to really defeat kind of this pervasive evil is to change it with your hand. Imam Talib, these are his words, not mine, but I endorse them wholeheartedly. You crack someone, I'm not inciting violence here, but hear me along. You hit someone in the mouth enough times, that mouth's not going to be fixed to say nothing wrong to you anymore, right? So I'm not saying that that's necessarily the way, and it's just a way to contextualize the hadith. But there are gradations of how we respond to being wronged, right? And this is case specific. But subhanAllah, like how long until people start to see you as a human being? And how long can you ask to be seen as a human being, right? So I want each of you to, for the questioner, everybody else who's listening, comes from a non-Black community, like next time you see that in your circle, and this is often in your own circles, right? It's not random people on the internet or on the street. It's like anti-Black violence that you see in your house with your relatives, with your aunt, your cousin. Don't let that stuff fly no more, right? Don't find the courage to be somebody who changes things in a way that's appropriate for that moment. But don't be, don't look away and then say, oh man, subhanAllah, that's unfortunate. That's both intellectual and, right, a spiritual cowardice. You have to be somebody that's firm in their beliefs. And sometimes, a smack upside the head works. I'm not saying violence is the answer, don't get me wrong. But when you've been in that situation, when your back is against the wall, subhanAllah, your options get limited, right? And so see Black people, not see, we demand that you see us as human beings, as people of value. And we are the people that we're the forerunners so that you could practice Islam today, right? Black Muslims, and specifically Black American Muslims, right? Who are on this country, like we would not be here if it was not for them. I always come back to the Immigrant Act of 1965, right? The masajid and the marakis in this country were dominated by people who were indigenous to this country, the African Americans of this country. Within less than a generation, in every major metro in America, those mosques were either sidelined or were filled with new leadership, not indicative, not representative of that community, right? It's a shame. It's a shame. Even today, look at the Muslim American Dawah scene now, both in Canada and in the US, who are seen as authorities. Don't give me the same 2 or 3 Black Americans who, you know, we see everywhere, but really who gets the most screen time, who gets the most airtime, who is deferred to, who is at the national level, at the state level, at the local level. If it's not somebody who's the inheritor of the Sunnah of this country, of resistance, then you got to start asking some hard questions. But that question, we have to move beyond this question, right? But it's a good question to ask. And maybe you're starting out and there is no shame, right? Shabi said there are no bad questions, only questions that are posed poorly, right? Maybe we should think about the systems in place that, why are we still asking how to support Black Muslims in 2021? That should just be a given. You hear me? Khair. Now, I don't want to see a clip on Twitter saying, you know, Mohamed, you know, advocates punch people in the face randomly. That's not what I'm saying. But, yeah.
All right. Next question is, what would you say to people who claim ethnic superiority over Black Muslims instead of recognizing that we are one ummah?
طيب. The Prophet salawatullah salamu alayhi tells us, إن الله لا ينظر إلى صوركم وأعمالكم ولكن ينظر إلى إن الله لا ينظر إلى أجسامكم ولكن ينظر إلى قلوبكم وأعمالكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not look at your physical appearances. This is not to say that there's a colorblind racism that Islam approves of. And I've seen this hadith be cited in that way, and it's actually pretty foul. But the Prophet's closing khutbah at the Hajj al-Wada is that no Arab is superior to an Ajam, be that anybody of non-Arab descent, right? So anybody who's preaching an ethic of superiority is somebody who's deeply out of Islam. And you'll see this defended even in classical books, right? The superiority of the Arabs over the Ajams, the superiority of Arabic over all languages. This is something that gets intellectualized, but there's really no concrete basis for this, right? We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has split us into nations and tribes so that we may know one another, right? لِتَعَارَفُوا, right? إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. And the closest to Allah among you is the one who's the most God-conscious, most God-fearing. Now, you'll see people use that to endorse, you know, I don't see race. Race is not central to me. Like, you know, we're all one ummah. And I've seen one ummah be weaponized in a way to really minimize our differences and to maximize, kind of this overarching homogeneity, if that's the right way to use that word. And it is an act of violence. We are one ummah. We're one ummah with distinct cultures, distinct backgrounds, distinct, ethnic and cultural and linguistic appreciations. And we need to, instead of trying to brush those one broad brushstroke, we need to highlight the beauty of that canvas, of that mosaic. And when we do that, then the myth of superiority goes away, right?
I know it's been like 2 hours, so let me know when you guys need to go.
I just add one more thing to that. Muhammad. We know Rasulullah's grandfather was said to have 10 sons that were black as night. So after saying everything that Ustad Muhammad said about, you know, how there's no superiority of one over another, no superiority of anyone over anyone else except by their faith, right? Then if you want to really help them understand, you point to the fact that Rasulullah, if you look among his Sahabas, you find many of them who today would be considered black, many of them who have African ancestry. And we can look at a couple of points from the Sunnah to see how the Rasulullah dealt with these kinds of issues, right? He didn't just deal with the issues by saying, hey, everybody's the same. He also dealt with these issues by putting black people, or because people really didn't see themselves as white and black back then as they do now. That is a product of all the stuff we talked about today, colonization, transatlantic slavery, right? If you were to tell somebody in ancient Rome they were a white man, they would look at you and not have the faintest idea of what you were talking about, right? Even the hadith, it's not, you know, it's often translated, the final speech of the Prophet ﷺ is often translated as, there's no support of a black over a white or white over black, right? But what is it actually, in actuality?
It's Arab over Ajam.
Arab over Ajam, right? And then, and is there not a place where he says, talks about the blacks and the browns, right? But he never says white.
White, never. That racialization is a post-colonial injection. There is no, the way that people are racialized now, they were never racialized in that, in those days.
And if someone was a European that we would call white today, what would they call them back then?
They would definitely not call them. They would, the closest, maybe a moniker Rumi or Yunani for people who were from that part of the world, right?
And I've also used say Ahmar. They would call them red.
No, 100%.
Nah, they would
which
call
is the
them
complexion that Ali ibn Abi Talib is referred to very often, right? He's said to have had ahmar skin. So is Umar, is said to have had ahmar skin. These racializations that we work under, and these are the a factor of very faulty and racialized translations is they just don't fit. No. They're not true to that time. No, Forgive me, Dr. Rasul.
No, Jazakallah, I was asking you. And so maybe we can call what was happening during the time of the Prophet ﷺ maybe like ethnocentrism or something like that. We wouldn't call it racism. But the way he dealt with this ethnocentrism is to empower people of Ethiopian descent and people who would be seen as being lowly in that society, right? So the example that you may know, or one of the examples that you may know of, is when Sayyidina Bilal, radiallahu anhu, when at the Fatu Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ told Bilal to go stand on top of the Kaaba. This black man, Ethiopian ancestry, formerly enslaved, to go stand on top of the Kaaba and call the adhan, right? But another hadith that I don't hear quoted as often in this context, in fact, it's been sort of mistranslated to try to make the opposite point, is when the Prophet ﷺ says, follow who's in charge, even if they be an Ethiopian with, we might say, kinky hair, right? And people wonder, okay, why would the Prophet ﷺ feel the need to say this, right? One of the Prophet ﷺ's last directives in his final days was during one of the campaigns when he told the people to follow Usama, radiallahu anhu, who was the son of Zayd, right? And Ayman, right? Radiallahu anhu, both of whom were of Ethiopian ancestry. Zayd, radiallahu anhu, was raised in the house of the Prophet ﷺ, the adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ. And it was so bad he had to get up out of his bed as he's in his final stages, where he's dealing with the sickness associated with his eventual returning to Allah ta'ala, right? He gets out of bed and says, I told you to follow Usama, and you're saying he's young, you don't want to follow him because of where he's from, just like you didn't want to follow his father, right? So the Prophet ﷺ didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk and put people in positions of authority and forced the people to follow the people that he put in positions of authority. So similarly, you want to know how to deal with this stuff. Some of it is, the people have to be made comfortable to follow a black woman or a black man, when it's appropriate.
Nothing but facts.
All right. I know it's already 5:14 for us, so we have a couple more questions. Are you guys comfortable with continuing?
I'm good if Dr. Miller is good, inshallah.
Inshallah. You said a couple, right? So that's two.
A little bit more than that. Y'all just let me know when you gotta
do
go.
some speed rounds, Dr. Miller, yeah.
All right.
We'll get through what we can.
How do you think Muslims should reckon with slavery in the Arab world in a way that makes them honor how much Muslim Africans have contributed to their societies?
Ooh, I would have to see this question. That was a lot. Maybe.
I'll send it in the chat. So.
Yeah, I don't think this is a question for here or now.
Okay.
Yeah, the onus for dealing with slavery is on enslavers, is not on generally on Muslims to burden. But Khair, is there another question we can do?
Well, I do want to say that point you made is super, super, super important, right? So when people come to you and start saying, hey, you Muslims, you engaged in slavery, right? Why is it that, the regular generality of Muslims doesn't have to answer for everything that any Muslim ever did, If that's the case, then, white folks who in America got a whole lot of explaining to do for
explain it. And the question around slavery is, subhanAllah, it's a conversation that we would never be able to honor in this space with this time either. No. So maybe we can. I will recommend. There's a lot of good books on this subject. Sylvian Dayus book that Dr. Miller mentioned earlier, Servants of Allah, is a wonderful foray into this. Jonathan Brown has a new book on slavery called Slavery in Islam, which is It's pretty good. I have some criticisms of it, but it's still pretty solid. So I can, if anyone wants, I can send them some resources, but this is just not a question that can be answered in this time.
All right. Next question is, what are y'all's thoughts on the dichotomization of religion versus culture? Are they mutually exclusive?
Dr. Miller, تفضل.
You know, that's, I don't know if I fully understand the question, you know. I mean, يعني, if I think what maybe you're getting at is the way people talk about distinguishing between, you know, what is religion? Like, okay, this is a part of Islam, and then this is from the culture, you know. But the ulama, they never saw culture as something that was static. You know, there's no sort of one overarching Muslim culture that looks the same everywhere. You know, culture is fluid. Islam is this perfect way of life that attends to cultural differences. The best way I've heard it explained is, if Islam is like pure, clean water that you can see through, then when it flows and takes on the color of the rocks in the ground that it flows over. So when Islam went to China, it took on a Chinese flavor. When Islam went to Somalia, it took a Somalian flavor. You know, when Islam went to everywhere else, it took on, you know, that kind of flavor. So I'm not fully sure what the questioner is asking, but if the point that they're making is that we shouldn't dichotomize culture and religion, I think that's a good point. At the same time, people sometimes elevate their culture to being, right? And will try to impose a culturally specific approach to Islam, or a culturally specific ruling on a matter, and make that, you know, the correct ruling of Islam, which is not appropriate. Imam Shafi, rahmatullahi, when he was in the desert, he had one way of teaching his fiqh. Then when he moved to Qahira, to Cairo, he had a different school, right? A different approach. And when they asked him why, he said, if I don't know that I have to have a different approach to teach people how to live their Islam by the Nile than I had when I was in the desert, then I'm not fit to give any kind of fatwa. So
I love that you incorporated the corpus of the Khadim. That's a good answer, Dr. Rasul, mashallah. If I can answer, I want to answer Chowder's question here.
No.
So what are some good resources on Islam in East Africa, especially Kenya, Swahili region, and Sudan? So I have a number of resources, and I can probably share them in the text box later maybe, but my go-to guy is a Somali scholar in the UK named Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah Artan, and I can write his name out in the chat. He is the founder of Aloha Press, and he writes pretty regularly on both Facebook and Twitter, but less Twitter, more Facebook, if you're ancient enough for that platform. He writes pretty regularly on Islam in East Africa, on Somali scholarship, on colonialism. He is a wonderful resource. A wonderful resource on Islam on the Swahili coast. The book is escaping me right now, but I can definitely share it. But there's a wealth of work done on the Islamic cultures of Zanzibar, of Tanzania, of Stone Town, of Lamu, of Pate, and even funnily enough, their connection, like Dr. Miller was mentioning, that trans-sub-Saharan connection to West Africa. A lot of the tariqas that pop up on the coast of East Africa have their roots. Surprisingly enough, there's a Tijani, I'm surprised with this, Dr. Miller, a Tijani presence in East Africa. I had no idea. I assumed that East Africa is dominated by the Salihiyya and the Qadiriyya, but so I can definitely link some. But Muhammad Abdullah Artan is a wonderful source. Dr. Matthews, you probably know him. He works on what's that? Do you know him? What's his first name?
I forget his first name as well. I haven't met him, but we've done some stuff together on Sapelo. Yeah,
Matthews. There's a scholar, a white American scholar who writes very well on East Africa. I'll find you his name. He's a wonderful resource. I'm saying.
Do you remember the author of that book you were trying to remember about Islam on the Swahili coast?
It's called. There's one author who chronicles like chimney poetry. somebody in the UK and somebody in the US who focuses on that. I think somebody at somebody who was at Harvard. They were classmates with Matthew Steele. I know they do a lot of work. Nathaniel Matthews, he's a wonderful resource on East Africa, Azania C. So he blogs under the name Azania C. His website, his blog is a great resource. Sudan, Matthew Steele, a good friend of mine at Harvard, doing wonderful work on Sudan, particularly the Maliki school and its manifestation in that part of the world. Dr. Usman Khan, I know, has done some work on Sudan as well. So there's a great, if you go to the Black Islam syllabus by our good friend, Dr. Kyla Wheeler, she has a syllabus, kind of the Black Islam syllabus, and there's a geography section, so you can break it down. It's called the Black Islam syllabus. Those are all good sources.
All right. Should I move on to another question?
Yeah, Dr. Miller, let's do one-on-one and then wrap.
All right. Non-Black Muslims expect emotional labor from Black Muslims in regards to education, anti-Black racism work. How can we politely tell them how problematic this is?
Just like that. Just like that. And I think it's a great question and a great point. And you know, you have to be, people have to understand, you know, when you say, hey, you know, this is a lot of energy, you know, I can't be spending all this time teaching, you got to take it, you got to learn for yourself, you know, that if a person is sincere, that answer should spark them to want to go do some work on their own, you know. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
That's all they wrote. That's a good answer, Dr. Miller.
Inshallah.
All right, I think that is all. We just had a couple questions of any recommended books and sorts. I think Ustad provided some in the chat.
In that syllabus that Dr. Kayla Wheeler that she put together, that Ustad Mohamed just put in the chat, that is, every book that I was getting ready to say is already on that syllabus. So that syllabus is a resource that I would encourage people to really spend time with, inshallah ta'ala.
All right, Jazakallah khair. I think we also have a question if how to reach to you guys, or how they can reach you guys. So if you have emails or any way of contact, we can provide that.
Yeah, I can drop my email. Would either of you consider doing a recurring lecture series? It's a fun a few days ago. It's something I think we posed. We would love to bring in more scholars, more Black Muslim scholars, Dr. Kayla Wheeler, Dr. Donna Austin, our good friend, Dr. Yusuf Carter. There's a lot of folks, mashallah, we're working, you know, at the intersection of Blackness and Islam. And so Dr. Miller and I certainly can help to facilitate that. And we would love to benefit from him and all other folks as well. I'm gassed, man. There's a lot of really intelligent, really dedicated scholars who are both in the academy and outside the academy, who are doing immense work. Our friend Sheikh Mohamed Mendez out in Jersey, who's really a qutb, somebody who's we depend on for this ilm, right? Our mentor, Imam Talib Abdul Rashid in Harlem. So, Ayan, maybe to your question is, you know, is there a way to facilitate knowledge and kind of the gathering and the sharing of knowledge from Black Muslim intellectuals, thought leaders, ulama, mashayikh, scholars? That's probably something that I know that everybody in this chat is interested in. So inshallah, reach out to your communities, find a way. And Dr. Miller and I have been talking about this for a little bit now. But it's bringing together a group of these folks who do this on the regular and sharing that knowledge, because our goal is really the dissemination and the sharing of knowledge. That's what we're interested in. And khidmah, service in that way.
All right, Jazakallah khairan, Ustad and Dr. Rasul Miller. It was a pleasure having you guys. Yeah.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you. It was a pleasure being with you all.
Jazakallah. It's a pleasure being with you all, inshallah. We'll make a dua for us, Dr. Miller and I, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps us firm and in good health. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.